Before I start this session, I want to honor the ground on which I stand, loaned to us by the children who have not yet been born, and with stewards of those who have gone before us. I honor the Maluleke and others who have walked on these grounds. Friends, I invite you this afternoon to listen to the drumbeats of Africa. I invite you this afternoon to join me around a fireplace of transformative conversations. When I grew up as a child in Kenya, in the rural places of Kenya, I sat around a dark fireplace in a grass-thatched house where there was no TV, there were no lights. We sat and we listened to stories. The dark night illuminated by flames from the fireplace. The smoke adding to the airiness and the frightening nature of that night. Join me at a fireplace of conversation where we sat and we listened to my grandmother telling us stories of our ancestors, stories of our parents, stories that connected one generation with another generation. You see, in Africa, we are reminded that those who tell the story rule. Those who tell the story rule. So let me tell you my story as a practitioner, and hopefully by telling you my story, you can find your story in my story. Or if you don't find your story in my story, you'll find your story in not my story. The story I'm going to tell you today is of a man on a canoe. I would have brought an actual African canoe, but it just became a bit troublesome to bring that in terms of the portability of it. But I could not, the idea of this canoe, when I actually pumped it, the irony could not be lost even more on me that here I am purporting to be an African standing on what is clearly not an African canoe. So I'll start my first talk by talking to you around the rower, the person on the canoe who is rowing. I'm standing also very precariously here because this stand in itself is shaky. So when you see me shaking, it's also as a result of the stand itself. So I'll start with the story of the rower who happens to be or who is an African systems thinking practitioner. And I'll tell you the story of my own story of being on this journey of an African as an African. I am an African. And I want to reflect a little bit on what it means for me to be an African. Who is an African? Is it by birth or by location? Is it because I was born on this continent? And if I say so, is it because there is something homogeneous about Africa, a land of great contrasts, from Morocco to Madagascar? But maybe the idea is to focus on Ubuntu that we have heard today about as an example and the expression of humanity, of a common humanity. Maybe an African is, because I realize that, as I said, I'm an African in a continent that is in transition. in line with Colin Turnbull's book of 1962, which he called The Lonely African. In that book, Turnbull tells the story of 5 Africans who are at the intersection of colonial rule. One of them married to a white person, and so on and so on. And what Turnbull reflects on is the dilemma that is facing these Africans who are at the intersection of the movement from their traditional ways of life to colonial and to more Western ways of life. And he depicts the title of the book, The Lonely African. And I want to suggest that Turnbull captured well the dilemma of the African whose ways of life has been disrupted by colonialism. The African who stood at the crossroads, confused and lonely. And today, as the world continues to change at an incredibly fast rate, I want to suggest that even today, that African, as stands before you, is a lonely African. Is a lonely and lonelier African, and maybe even lost. So maybe the question about who is an African is not about race or ethnicity. Maybe it's about another form of identity that defines the search for the lost soul of Africa. Wayne Visa said, "I am an African, not because I was born here, but because my heart beats with Africa's. I am an African, not because my skin is black, but because my mind is engaged by Africa. I am an African, not because I live on its soil, but because my soul is at home in Africa." But friends, as we sit at this ISSS conference, there is another even more sad question that I need to ask. It's the untold story of Africa in systems thinking, practice, and writings. Why is the story of Africa not told? As you will see when we go through this conference, there is a lot about systems thinking within African philosophies. Africa can contribute something valuable in the field of systems thinking. In common with mainstream systems thinking are concepts like interdependence, relationality, communitarianism. 2 big words that I want, and you will hear them a lot in the course of our conference, is the concept of Ubuntu and the concept of Ukama. These 2 big philosophies within African thought, Ubuntu and Ukama. Ubuntu starts from the premise of I am because we are. And as Mbiti says, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am, closing that loop. Oftentimes you will hear the one side, I am because we are. But there is also, and since we are, therefore I am. It's not just the we, it's not just the I at the expense of the we or vice versa. We is not an antithesis of I, but Ubuntu is a confluence between we and I and we. Ukama, on the other hand, talks about cosmic interrelationality. That is not just humans, it's even the non-human that are also interrelated and interdependent. So I ask the question to us today, why have the voices of African philosophy, which are so close to systems thinking thought, been silenced? Why have we not heard them? Why have they been ignored in the discourses that we are having? Let me take this moment to commend Rolien and her team. I salute you, Rolien and your team, that bravely took the decision to bring this conference here. Because I even said to her at the beginning, I said, even if we got here and we were told something has happened, The lions are very hungry, we must run. And we all get into our buses and we go home. It would still be worth it. That Africa was positioned on the map of the ISSS and the conversations about systems thinking and practice. It was a very brave move. And I hope that in future, when the stories are told about Czechland, Stafford Beer, and all the other greats, there will be a mention about Africa philosophy and Africa thought. And so I ask as a fireside conversation, is the identity of the practitioner important in the understanding of systems thinking? And before you quickly jump in to say, yes, it is, I want to ask you, what about the implications of that? Because the implications of that are that if we say that the identity of the person is important in the practice, we did hear from Ray talking to us about all practice is situated. If it is situated, then why are we not also taking attention to where we are presently today? And that's why I also salute Stephanie, who said, why don't we dismantle the arrangement and say that when we finish this session, we're going to finish it earlier and say, can you go and see where are you? Because we are in Africa. We are in a different place. We are in a place that needs us to recognize the ground on which we walk. If we take the identity of the practitioner seriously, then we need to rethink the spaces we are creating for systems thinking awareness and interventions. We need to be thinking who sits on the boards of ISSS and all the other systems, conferences and events that are going on. We need to think about democratization and decoloniality of those spaces. We need to rethink the language we use. My wife has never been to a class on systems thinking. And one time she attended one, and she came back and she says, can you talk without saying epistemology, ontology, axiology? Can you talk English? Today my wife practices VSM, Viable Systems Model. And every time I look at her and I think, the way we talk with Martin about it, we say, the way Tembela uses VSM, if Stafford Beer was to wake up from the dead, he would die again. Because my wife has butchered it and done whatever she wants with it. But guess what? It works for her. Isn't that the space of the practitioner when we take the language out and allow ourselves to engage as human beings? My children, I asked them, I said to my daughter, what does it mean, this what your daddy does? And she said, I have no clue what you do. And I said, neither do I. But let's try and find each other. And as a result, we've now created a forum for young people. When I say to them about systems thinking, they said, Daddy, who talks about systems? When you say systems, I think cogs and wheels. They've come up with their own name for it. I may not agree, but that's their name for it. They call it Soul for X. That's what they're doing. We need to become aware of the power dynamics within the spaces we are creating for systems thinking engagement. That's the roar, my dear friends. I position to you that alongside the other metaphors, the other ways of defining the practitioner, Ray Ison talks about the juggler. I can also position myself as the rower. Let me talk about the second part. The second part of this rower is that this rower is faced with is the forest of leadership development. A forest is not a collection of trees. It is a complex interplay of emergent realities that happen not only between the trees, but also the other animals and plants in the forest. And as this guy sits there in the canoe looking at what confronts him with a village behind him as he goes towards the forest. The forest in Africa is not just a collection of trees. It is a mystical place of the deep mysteries and the unknown. It is a place where we find ourselves again when we are lost. In Africa, if you never knew, trees talk. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear them talk while you are here. If they talk too loudly, you might need medical attention. But it's a place where trees talk. Listen carefully. I'm suggesting that, like the forests in Africa, we need to remove the sandals of our feet and walk with humility when we tread on the ground covers of leadership development. I'm suggesting that leadership development is a forest that is sacred, spiritual, and mystical. Sadly, we have reduced leadership development to a few techniques and tools and cliches and mantras. Learn what Steve Covey says, John Maxwell says, and you'll live happily ever after. It's a forest. We have reduced leadership development in the schools that I teach in to search for accreditation. And so you go on the schools, and the first billboard that greets you is we are triple accredited and we are closest to Harvard and Yale and Harvard and London. That seems to be the hallmark of a good business school. It's not about what you got, it's about where did you get it. We've reduced leadership development to that. The forest speaks of the collective wisdom that cannot be found in any one tree, no matter how big or strong it is. Professor Wangari Maathai said, "A tree has roots in the soil, yet it reaches to the sky." It tells us that in order to aspire, we need to be grounded, and that no matter how high we go, it is from our roots that we draw sustenance. It is a reminder to all of our governments, no matter how many awards we receive, our power and strength and our ability to reach our goals depends on the people, those whose work remains unseen, who are the soils out of which we grow, the shoulders on which we stand. So how did I get into this mystical forest of leadership development? I was doing the same thing, running around saying Steve Covey says, John Maxwell says, you need to know the 5 principles of leadership. And no, there's no a 6th one. There can only be 5. Memorize them and you'll live happily ever after. And I taught that and I earned for that. And I got back to my room and I thought, what if there's a 6th one? What if it's not just the 5th discipline, maybe there is a 6th and a 7th one? The answers we were giving to people were very simplistic. And I turned to a friend of mine and said, I'm disillusioned. I'm disillusioned with what we are doing. And he says, do you know about systems thinking? So systems thinking was purported to me to be the answer, the tablet. I have discovered since that it's not. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. The forest speaks of the collective wisdom. We present neat answers when the actual practice is complex and messy. I was on a trip with some people in Malawi, and the driver who took me from the airport said to me, Sammy, what do you do? I said, I do leadership development. And I explained. And he said, like Steve Covey. I thought, oh, wow. I said, sure, like Steve Covey. Sure. And I said, what do you know about Steve Covey? And he said they were taken on a training by the Ministry of Health. And when he came back, he says, when I came back from the training, I discovered that Steve Covey doesn't work here. I knew he doesn't work there because he's dead. But I could not help think that this driver already understood that Steve Covey doesn't work here. The simplistic answers that they were getting don't work with the complexity and the messiness of the situations that they are facing. Heather, an 80-year-old friend of mine who recently rested, she asked me, Sammy, what do you do? And I said, leadership development. And Heather looked at me again and said, I said, yeah, leadership development. Louder and more affirming. Leadership development. Heather, we train leaders. Yeah. Well, we equip leaders. Okay. And Heather asked me a question that I want to ask you. If everyone is trained to be a leader, who will they lead? And I will never forget that. And I'm asking you, in the field of leadership development, if everyone is trained to be a leader, who will they lead? Where are the followers? So for us, I ask, what are the implications on us as practitioners if we took followership seriously? Let me go to the third one. And it's the river. We're now in the river. And it's a river that has been described in many ways. Those of us who are in the steep, we did hear Martin and others talking about the waves. They've been discussed at many other times. They've been discussed in terms of the cybernetics, hard systems thinking, soft systems thinking, and all sorts of things like that. An African proverb says, only a fool steps into an unknown river with both feet. Only a fool steps into an unknown river with both feet. So I want to step cautiously with one foot and test it. And the river in my story is the rich confluence of systems thinking tributaries. I don't think there are only 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. No. They've been there. Listen. Do you hear them? It's tributaries. African thought, Asian thought, what? They've been there. Waves, primal systems thinking, Sufi Islam, Eastern traditions, African traditions, general systems thinking, hard systems, cybernetics, and so on. I position myself as one who is in the river, in a canoe. Quite a flimsy one, but yeah, it's a canoe. And I'm watching this confluence of emergent practices and thoughts as the different tributaries come together. The river of systems thinking tributaries. And when I think about that way, the distinctions become not as important. Well, they are important. They contributed to where we are. But the confluence becomes even more important. The intersectionalities become even more important. Friends, my story takes us back to the fireplace. So let me ask you, as you come into this conference, what do you come with? What do you hear from what I am saying to you? And I want to suggest from my own practice, from my own ways of working, there are few things that I have gathered from systems thinking. And I put them as flows, as movements, as conversations. The first one is a movement, the flow between being systemic and systematic. And we've had that, those of us who are here, and even when Ray was talking a bit earlier. The balcony and the dance floor. But instead of seeing them as two positions, my focus is more on the flow between the systemic and the systematic and the systemic, the balcony and the dance floor and the balcony. The second flow is a flow between reality and constructs. And again, it's not either or. It is about the confluence. And the third one, it's the flow, the conversation between the knower, the known or the knowable, and the process of knowing. And again, it's not so much about the demarcations. In a river, you can't tell exactly where the tributary ends and starts. It's that the tributary contributed to this process of knower, the known, and the process of knowing. And so my final question to you, as I look at the tributaries going forward, I think I invite us to see the different systems, the approaches as confluences of a river system with tributaries, to become aware of the tributaries. And for me, one of the tributaries that I am noting that is contributing is a tributary of care, of sustainability and ethics. And maybe that's where Ubuntu and Ukama needs to play their part in helping us to understand beyond the text, beyond the written, as we heard today about Desmond Tutu and others, this reflection around practice. This reflection around practice that is driven by a concern for ethics, for sustainability, for inclusivity. Maybe here is where we can hear Ukama and Ubuntu alongside other indigenous voices. 2 years ago, almost to the date, I was lying in ICU myself. 7 weeks in ICU with COVID, 2 of those weeks in a coma, on life support, on a machine called ECMO. And the doctor phoned my wife and said, doesn't look good here. You can come and collect his things. My wife said, I reached out firstly to her spirituality, her faith. But the second part that was very important for me and for her, she reached out to community. She gathered my friends on social media. She created a group that grew to over 350 people. They were getting daily updates. They prayed, they encouraged, they talked about me. They kept her going during those 7 weeks that were very difficult weeks. And then somebody in the group said, can we do more than just prayer? Sami is a consultant. What will his children be eating while he's in hospital? They raised more than 350,000 rand. Today I stand here as a testament, as a witness to the power of the collective, the community, the Ubuntu in practice. Moto, kemoto, kabato. That's Sutu for saying a person is a person because of people. So could we be entering another phase? And I think Martin Reynolds asked us that, and Ray also asked us that. As we ask the question about into the next wave, I've seen Cabrera, Gerard Midri and others wrestling with the question of could we be entering into another wave? Maybe it's a tributary of care, ethics, and inclusivity. And what would systems thinking look like if it did that? So while I rest my case, I want to suggest some umpako. Umpako is Zulu word for the little box, the little container you get given by your mother that has got some food for your journey. In other words, they also call it iskaftini. It's a small container you get given as a child, and they put food in there for when you are going on a long journey. You carry umpako. And as we embark on this journey of this time at this conference, I want to suggest a few thoughts for us. One is that I think we as systems thinking practitioners, thought leaders, wherever, we need to be inclusive of insights from other non-mainstream traditions. And we need to actively look for that. We need to actively look for that. I think we in this conference, in the words of Varna Ulrich, need to be witnesses for other voices. I was asking one of my friends here that I have made, Prof. Vonani, and I asked and I said, are we going to get PhDs that are oral? Because I come from an oral tradition. Let me sit and tell you my story and you give me a PhD. But it still needs to be written. Yeah, but that's the part. That's a problem. Can you just listen to me talk? Friends, while we are talking about insights from other mainstream traditions, this year I almost did not register for my PhD because of lack of resources and funding. And maybe if we are serious about including voices, then we need to open up avenues for students from Global South, from other areas, to come in and be part of the mainstream conversations. We need to be able to put resources to saying we will sponsor students, research students, to come and continue the conversation, not as people who are being assisted, but as people who can help us learn as well. I grew up with the power of story. And I think we need to take story seriously. I think it's Nora Bateson who talks about the fact that we draw lines. And lines never represent relationships. Stories represent relationships. And I hope you'll take advantage of the time that we have here to listen to story and to also share in story. Stories fire our imagination, taking us to places we have never been. Stories also enable fun and play. The third thing is that I hope we can revise our models of leadership development and find models that are more intergenerational and artisanal, as we have been hearing. There's a stray child of systems thinking that we hardly ever talk about. I saw it a little bit in Ray's diagram, the whole area of family systems theory and family systems thinking. Often in mainstream conversations, you don't hear much discussion about that particular stream. But increasingly, we are finding a lot of organizational anxiety, especially post-COVID. And we maybe need to go back and say, have we lost something by not listening to the wisdom that came from family systems theory, the work of people like Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman, who talk about organizational anxiety and looking at organizations as family systems? Is there something that we can be able to get there? Importantly for me, from family systems, is the recognition of the self, of the awareness of the I and the we and the me. When we greet here in isiZulu, we greet Sawubona. I see you. Sawubona is I see you. I recognize you. In Venda, we talk about Vonani. Vonani was telling us that at the table, and she'll be telling us more. I see you. I recognize you. I hope you'll take time at this to see and to recognize. And then I ask myself, with all these systems thinking that is sitting here in this room, why do we still have all the problems we have in the world? If people are as clever as the ones that I have interacted with just yesterday, a few days, and today, and so on, why are we still having the problems we are having? And I want to suggest that maybe we need to listen a little bit to the wisdom that Otto Scharmer comes up with from the whole discussion around Theory U, but also especially the movement from ecosystem to ecosystem. Maybe we're trapped too much into ecosystem where it's about us, and we need to listen to the wisdom around ecosystem. He says, is it that we don't have eyes to see? And true, sometimes we don't. We've sheltered ourselves, surrounded ourselves. Is it that we sometimes see, but we don't have the heart to feel? And sometimes when you've seen something so many times, it deadens your conscience and your emotions. Or is it maybe that we are unable to act because we can't be able to work collectively together to do something? So this movement from ecosystem to ecosystem. And so, dear friends, I conclude with this. I want to encourage you to journey with a question. Let the question be your guide. We were traveling with my family one time from Johannesburg. Many of you flew, you didn't drive. But those of you who drove, somewhere about an hour from Pretoria, there's a town called Bella Bella, Wombats. And we were coming to Limpopo. It was a Friday afternoon, traffic was hectic. So we're driving up from Johannesburg, past Pretoria. And at that point in the car, it was 5 in the evening. We're trying to get to these places before they close the gate. And at that point, summer they close around 7, so we're trying to... At that point, there was a smell in the car. It's the smell that you cannot ignore for very long. So after a while, I said, who has made the poo? Now, it's not me, because I'm the one asking the question. Hopefully, it's not my wife. Who has made the poo? There were 2 children at the back. Jenga was 2 years old, and Wanjiro was 6 years old. Take your pick. Who has made the poo? And, and Jenga, the 2-year-old said, Jenga, like flip, what's wrong with you? I stopped the car where we are not going to be hijacked. Looked around. My dear wife is doing her nails. She says, get into the bag, get the wet wipes, and make sure you wipe him properly. Go out. I'm looking around. We are not being hijacked. Put the guy on the floor, the ground. I opened the nappy, and it was dry. We were going through a particular section, and those of you who drove may have known it. There's a particular section that has an offensive smell. I don't know whether it's piggeries or it's sewage works or something else. So I furiously put him in the car, and I'm furious with everybody now, and I'm driving like mad, and then it hit me. What was my mistake? And then I realized I asked the wrong question. I said, who has made the poo? How else could I have asked that question? What is smelling? That day, I learned something that Rolene doesn't pay me to tell you, and I'll tell you. I'll tell you for free. If you ask a poo question, you'll get a poo answer.